Movie video games often catch a ton of flack for not being very good. As far back as I can remember, there have been video games based on popular movies, and in this episode we will be exploring this subject on one of my favorite systems, the Sega Genesis. We will be looking at around 50 titles that I want to cover, all games tied directly to a theatrical release. I did not add TV shows or comic book video games, and we will be going down this list in rapid fire succession to manage time. I hope you guys enjoy movie video games. Are they really that bad? This 1994 action platformer was originally a Super Nintendo game done by Malibu Interactive. It was only released on the Genesis in North America by Psygnosis, in what would be a very middling experience. The graphics are fairly colorful and the animation isn't bad, but the music and sound effects do tend to grate after a while. The gameplay simply isn't very interesting, nor does it have a hook to keep you playing. Kill a few enemies, break open a few boxes, and get through the level. It's pretty standard stuff. There is a Sega CD version of it if you'd like a better soundtrack and a few bonus levels. There are two Addams Family games on the Sega Genesis, both directly tied to the movies produced in the 1990s. The first was released in late 1993, developed by Ocean Software and published by Flying Edge, a division of Acclaim. This platformer actually has some interesting gameplay, resembling a Mario game in many respects. There's power-ups that allow you to shoot projectiles and fly, and the presentation is solid with great animation and color. It would likely appeal to a younger gamer the most, but this wasn't a half-bad game at all. The sequel is a completely different experience. Released in 1995 only in Europe for the Mega Drive, Ocean would develop and publish this one, an overhead adventure game more akin to Zelda than anything else. Lots of story and exploration here, so both games kinda cater to different groups of players. One more action, the other more adventure. Neither not so terrible. (1992's) Alien 3 by Probe Software was published by Arena, yet another subsidiary of Acclaim, and was a run-and-gun winner from the moment you took control. A timer pushes you through each level that has you saving people from the dreaded aliens. Animation and music are the highlights here, in what is perhaps one of the better games Acclaim would produce for the Genesis. It's hard and requires a lot of memorization and trial and error, but a solid experience overall. In 1992, Blue Sky Software would sully the fine reputation of the Sega-Disney relationship with Ariel the Little Mermaid. Despite Disney games typically looking and sounding good on the Genesis, this engine not only looks bad, but it runs bad too. The gameplay is about as boring as a game can get, basically little more than you collecting things in a maze. Two characters that play exactly the same give little reason to care. And despite playing a bit like Echo the Dolphin, it has none of that game's challenge or higher-end design elements. It's a huge misfire that is best left in the past. In 1991, Probe Software would take a huge shit on every Genesis owner that was unfortunate enough to pay money for Back to the Future 3. Dark, soulless graphics rape your eyes, awful music assaults your hearing, and right from the moment you press start, the obscene difficulty will make you want to stop playing it immediately. Garbage like this is what gave movie games their bad rap in the first place, and I can't recommend enough that you avoid it entirely. An awful experience with absolutely nothing positive to mention. Sometimes the stars align perfectly and a movie game just kills it, and one of the first games I played to do that was 1990's Batman from Sunsoft. Great action and platforming created a solid base for the experience, and it looks pretty good too. And if that wasn't enough, Sunsoft also saw fit to give us one of the finest Genesis soundtracks ever created, the kind of stuff you sit in absolute amazement the first time you hear it. This is a winner that every Genesis owner needs in their library. When Sega took over the Batman license, their first game was 1993's Batman Returns, developed by Malibu Interactive. I hate this game with a passion. Not just because it wasn't as good as the Sunsoft effort, but also because Sega should have done it in-house to begin with. Everything about this fails to appeal to me. The dark and colorless graphics looks far worse than it should, and the sound is just point-blank awful. The gameplay is asinine too, with Batman not only having to deal with enemies, but also stupid environment dangers that are placed in areas for no other reason than to keep your deaths coming to extend its horrendous gameplay. A Sega CD version of this with cool driving sections redeems the property a bit, but as far as the standalone Genesis game, it's a big letdown and nowhere near the quality of the previous Sunsoft release. If Sega's attempt at Batman was a disappointment, Probe Entertainment's Batman Forever was a full-on shitting of the bed. Published in 1995, Acclaim jumped on the bandwagon of digitizing everything like Mortal Kombat, but apparently forgot to put a little effort into the gameplay as well. Awkward animations, slow and plodding combat, and music and sound effects that everyone involved should be ashamed of define this awful title. It makes Batman Returns seem like a damn masterpiece. In 1993, Sunsoft devised a strange strategy of breaking up the Beauty and the Beast license across two simultaneous releases. The first of these is Roar of the Beast, an action game that was aimed at boys. Despite looking pretty good, the gameplay is just terrible. The limited attacks you have help little against the onslaught of enemies you face, and you'll get sick of this pretty fast. It lacks any interesting changes as the game progresses, so you'll find yourself doing the same thing over and over, more akin to the games of the mid-1980s and not the stuff being released in 1993. The second title, Belle's Quest, was aimed squarely at girls, but suffers even more than the other game. Here, poor Belle can't even attack, instead just able to jump and duck and hide. There's elements here the other game doesn't have, like mini-games and character interactions, but with nothing really to do but walk around, you lose interest pretty damn fast. Bram Stoker's Dracula was released in 1993 by Sony ImageSoft and developed jointly by Psygnosis and Traveler's Tales. Simple gameplay mechanics and uninspired visuals pretty much sum up this entire experience. Nothing about this one is awful or worth beating up. There's just simply not a lot to do here or get excited about. Jumping around killing spiders, bats, and rats can only be but so fun, especially with nothing really changing level to level. It does have a weirdly appealing soundtrack, but outside of that, this one is a skipper. Genesis owners were victimized by Malibu Interactive yet again with 1993's Cliffhanger. Based on the Sylvester Stallone action flick, this is a predictable beat-em-up with poor mechanics and bland environments. The use of the GEM sound driver is put to effective use here, blaring its screeches and squeals into each ear, guaranteeing hearing loss of some kind for everyone that experiences it. A Sega CD game was released as well with the bog standard additions of full motion video sequences and ridiculously difficult forward scrolling levels. Multi-platform mediocrity in all its glory. In 1995, the awful film Cutthroat Island got its very own game, courtesy of Software Creations and Acclaim, a side-scrolling hack-and-slash with mundane visuals and an equally weak soundtrack. You won't find many Genesis games that play as poorly either, making this disaster an all-around fail in every category. It's rare you'll hear me say a game has no value at all, but Cutthroat Island comes damn close to that dishonor. In perhaps a shocking turn of events for an Acclaim release, 1995's Demolition Man is actually not a bad game at all. It was developed by Alexandria and uses both side-scrolling and overhead perspectives to deal out its run-and-gun gameplay. Solid animation is present throughout, and even the stage design looks pretty good. It reminds me a bit of both Alien 3 and the Terminator, and has some of the best voice samples on the hardware. The Sega CD version has a completely different soundtrack and full motion video scenes, but is otherwise the same game.
Send the maniac to catch one.
Sega of America would develop and release 1991's Dick Tracy. I rather enjoyed this game because it played a lot like eSWAT and a few other Japanese-developed games. You get enemies coming at you from both a forward and background plane that keeps things hectic and always giving you something to beat up or shoot at. The detailed and colorful graphics look outstanding, and Sega even nailed a halfway faithful soundtrack. One of their better efforts and very much worth your time. Aladdin came along in late 1993, a collaboration between Virgin Games and Disney Software, with Sega publishing it. Gorgeous animation and color are the highlights here, backed up by responsive gameplay that gives you all sorts of things to play around with. Only its soundtrack disappoints, but I can't hold that against it when everything else is this well done. Super late in the life of the Genesis, we'd get Pinocchio in late 1996, another collaboration between Disney and Virgin Interactive. One would assume that giving this title's late release and the property on which it's based, that it wouldn't be very good. I made that very assumption, but I was completely wrong. Pinocchio here is actually a really solid game. You get large, extremely well animated sprites, some decent gameplay, and even a few different characters to play as. Only the silly dance sections are a real problem. It isn't the best of the Disney properties, but it's far from the worst. I definitely recommend you at least give it a try. Acclaim's deluge of software continued on the Genesis with 1994's Dragon: The Bruce Lee Story. This is set up with scenes from the movie and plays out as a fighting game. Some nice parallax and line scrolling effects punctuate each of these stages, but the gameplay is rather simple, with more in common with older games like Street Smart than something like Street Fighter. Fights go on for too long and I got really bored with this after a while. Still, it isn't bad for what it is, and can definitely be fun for younger gamers. In 1994, famed strategy game developer Westwood Studios would develop Dune: The Battle for Arrakis for the Genesis. This is based on the PC game Dune 2, and the Genesis conversion is exceptional for a console-based strategy game. Choose one of 3 factions, or houses in this case, and get out there and secure your resources and protect them at all cost. This is one of the few implementations of the GEMS sound driver that is really good, giving the rather plain Jane visual presentation some much needed help. Of course, in the years since its release there have been better strategy games, but in 1994 this was absolutely awesome. A Sega CD version exists as well, but that's an adventure game that has nothing to do with the cartridge version. The story behind 1991's Fantasia is quite strange. It was said that the Walt Disney Company had licensed out the IP for a game without the knowledge of Roy Disney, who was under a personal promise to his Uncle Walt to never have Fantasia remade in any manner. Disney then requested that Sega pull all copies of the game at retail and cease its production, actually paying Sega back for all the development, advertising, and physical copies lost. This story would be supremely interesting had it not been a complete and utter shitshow of incompetence orchestrated by Sega of America. It was released broken and damn near unplayable by all but the most dedicated players. Hit detection is a joke, the music is atrocious, and the difficulty is absurd for a game clearly aimed at young children. Only its visual stylings offered any real positives, but when a game is so bad that those that made it admit that it's unplayable, there isn't much else that needs to be said. Early Genesis games tended to be a joy if for nothing more than they offered unique experiences you couldn't play on any other console. 1990's Ghostbusters was one such game, developed by Compile and Sega R&D 2. Unlike the Sega Master System game, this is a side-scrolling action platformer that has the guys exploring various places to find the head ghost in charge and get rid of him. The pleasant presentation is colorful and sounds good, with easy play mechanics that anyone can enjoy. It isn't a particularly deep game, but has everything else it needs to be fun. Sometimes you just had to shake your head at some of the stuff Sega of America thought was worth releasing to its dedicated fan base. Few games sum up that very thought better than 1992's Home Alone. Sort of a hybrid of a platformer and strategy game, you need to survive the time limit while the wet bandits attempt to plunder your neighborhood. You get all sorts of weapons and traps, but unfortunately none of it is fun. The entire game is just one long exercise of slowing down the idiotic AI bad guys, who fall for every trick you have repeatedly and without fail. I can see younger players digging this simplicity, but for most of us, this travesty of a license will see you last 5 minutes and move on. Sadly, Sega tried again with Home Alone 2 Lost in New York, another shallow platformer with poor mechanics. Everything here is uninteresting, just as bad looking, and set in a world where even holiday travelers are out to kill you. Its awful gems-fueled audio hamstrings it further, a terrible game that makes the first one look like a rock star. Core Design would do the honors importing 1993's Hook. This was another classic example of a movie game that wasn't bad, yet nothing great either. The gameplay is standard fare with not a lot of variety or any form of extras to keep things interesting. The gameplay is too slow and floaty with what feels like moon gravity. The graphics are kinda blah too, but I didn't mind the sound as much as I thought I would. A Sega CD version exists as well with music from the movie. It's okay. (1992's) Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade had both US Gold and tier text behind it, so you just had to expect something truly awful. And not surprisingly, it turned out as bad as licensed games could get. It doesn't look that great, sounds bad, and everything took way too many hits to kill. It has that irritating stage design of water killing you, both on the ground and on the ceiling, and the infuriating difficulty makes even the early stages hard, giving you next to no chance to get used to the gameplay before you want to quit. I would recommend that you try this before you think about buying a copy. I was expecting one of the worst games I'd ever played, and it did not disappoint. Mid-1995 would bring yet another adaptation of a Sylvester Stallone vehicle, Judge Dredd. Acclaim would publish this probe-developed joint, and similar to Demolition Man, this isn't so bad a game. Run-and-gun action is the order of the day, and large levels give you plenty to explore and shoot at. Unfortunately, enemies take way too much to kill, and it lacks any real variety in the things you do. You run around and shoot the same things for the entire game, not really encountering any unique boss battles or anything to break up that repetition. The animation and visual style does win at some points in the positive column, but this one still ranks just above average for a movie tie-in game, and well below the better games on the system. Virgin Interactive and Disney Software would come together again for the 1994 game based on The Jungle Book. Like most of these Disney games, you get superb animation and presentation. It doesn't play too dissimilar from The Lion King. Basically lots of platforming, climbing, and cute enemies. Lots of little movie touches and things to do really elevate this above the common doldrums of the genre, and I recommend it highly. Only its gems-driven music disappoints overall. Sega scored the rights to Jurassic Park during the Genesis era, releasing the Blue Sky Software vision of the IP in 1993. It's a side-scrolling action game that has a pretty steep difficulty, though the animation and locations look fantastic. It's a good game if you can stomach the challenge. There was a direct sequel to this called Jurassic Park Rampage Edition a year later with a brand new story and many gameplay and visual tweaks. The Sega CD version was radically different, instead opting for a point-and-click adventure over the mechanics you see here. Sega wasn't done with the IP either, also scooping up the rights to The Lost World, the sequel to Jurassic Park, and releasing it in late 1997. Appaloosa Interactive would be at the helm of this one, giving us a top-down action game nothing like the previous efforts. It does look pretty good for what it is, and the gameplay isn't bad, giving a solid variety of vehicles and bonus stages to mess around with. Sega released radically different versions of this on the Saturn and Game Gear as well. I wasn't too big a fan of the film The Last Action Hero, and when the 1993 Genesis game was released, I wasn't a fan of that either. Published by Sony ImageSoft and developed by Bit Studio, it's a side-scrolling action game with pitiful gameplay, terrible sound, and weak graphics. Its dull and boring gameplay mechanics sealed its fate as a bad experience, and is one of the worst games I played in this episode. Only those poor kids stuck with it as a Christmas present could have ever found any enjoyment here. (1994's) The Lawn Mower Man was a hell of an interesting game. Published by Time Warner and developed by Tech London, it uses an incredible forward-scrolling engine that is buttery smooth and nothing short of jaw-dropping for a machine that has no dedicated hardware to pull it off. Some of these stages have you simply avoiding stuff, and others have shooting elements to deal with. There's even some vehicle-based stuff and side-scrolling shoot-'em-up stages to add impressive variety. While there are some gameplay issues with difficulty, you can't help but be impressed by this. It really did try and pull off something new, and I recommend it on that strength alone. There's a Sega CD version of this, but it's a completely different game and nowhere near as good. Virgin Interactive, Westwood Studios, and Disney Software would all come together for 1994's The Lion King. Play as Simba as you go from a playful cub to looking to avenge your fallen father. This is a really easy to pick up and play platformer with solid animation and stage graphics. There are a few spikes in difficulty here that will make it rough on the average gamer, but a good game nonetheless. Every time I see this, I can't help but to think how awesome it could have been on the Sega CD. Full movie soundtrack, fully animated opening and ending, and some cool scaling stages to add a bit more gameplay in there, and we'd have had a winner. In 1994, Sony ImageSoft and Bit Studio would curse the world of Sega Genesis ownership with the awful Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It makes Bram Stoker's Dracula look like Castlevania Bloodlines. I'll waste no more of my time or yours on it. Believe it or not, 1990's Michael Jackson's Moonwalker was based on a film released a few years prior. That film was a collection of short stories, and the Sega Genesis game here was an adaptation of the smooth criminal portion of that film. It's a side-scrolling action game that has you rescuing children from the evil Mr. Big. Everything about the gameplay here is simple as hell. Stages repeat multiple times, and outside of some quirky dance music, you'll be doing the same stuff over and over. This is one of those games where you had to be there at the time to understand its appeal. Michael Jackson had been the world's biggest pop star at the time, yet untouched by the controversy that would dog his career soon after. It was loaded with style, and his mere inclusion elevated its status. In 1995, Sims and Band Presto would come together to make a game adaptation of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie. It's a beat-em-up in similar style to something like Streets of Rage, with both human and mech battles. There are a ton of issues with this game, including lack of enemy variety, lack of challenge, and it's too short. But you know what? I don't care, because this game looks good and has an absolutely killer soundtrack. Many will blow through this and move on unimpressed, but it's a great one to play with your kids thanks to its two-player co-op. Turn up the sound and enjoy it while it lasts. No Escape was a 1994 release by Sony ImageSoft and Bits Corporation. This side-scrolling adventure has you searching an island for the parts you need to make your escape. Like the other games done by Bits, this one isn't very good either. The repetitive music alone is enough to have you reaching for the power switch after 10 minutes. Slow attacks, awful stage design, and boring gameplay seal this game's fate. Fox Interactive and Prove would get together to release the Page Master in 1994. I was expecting to thoroughly hate this from the moment I began, but you know, it isn't half bad. The animation and overall feel is very similar to a number of Sega's Disney titles, and the gameplay is kid-friendly. There is also some really cool forward scaling levels that are really smooth and look great, definitely adding some visual flair. It isn't a great game by any means, but considering how bad its potential was, I'll take it. Funcom and Disney Interactive would do 1996's Pocahontas. One of the most beautiful 16-bit games you'll ever see, this effort drips with style and personality. The animation alone is worth high praise, but the environments are equally gorgeous. There's lots of variety here in the gameplay too. Stealth, multiple characters to play as, and puzzle elements keep things fresh, and I was only really let down by the sound and music, which is yet again powered by the frequently terrible GEM sound driver. In 1992, Arena would release the odd game adaptation of Predator II. It's a top-down run-and-gun multi-directional shooter that has you fighting every gang member in Los Angeles, in addition to a freaking predator. What's here isn't so bad, but I also wouldn't say it's particularly great either. The point-blank strange soundtrack is just weird, and the constant onslaught of enemies gives you no rest, and stopping or resting is rewarded instantly with guaranteed damage. The hectic design will appeal to some, but many will be turned away instantly. Shortly after the hardware's debut in 1989, we'd get Rambo III by Sega themselves. It's an overhead run-and-gun shooter that had a decent variety of weapons and items, and stages that were designed with labyrinth-like qualities. I loved this game as a kid, drawn to the lone wolf mechanics and thrill of taking control of a favorite action hero. Rambo 3 here won't win any awards for graphics or sound, but it has enough going for it to be a great part of any Genesis collection. Robocop 3 wasn't the best in that trilogy of movies, and Robocop 3 the game isn't so hot itself. It has some of the worst animation I've ever seen in a game, making our robotic hero walk and shoot terribly awkward. Fortunately, the gameplay fares a bit better than the presentation, and the shoot-'em-up action has its moments. Most of the gameplay is centered on side-scrolling levels, but there are also vertically scrolling levels in there too. Not the best, not the worst, perhaps worth a try to see where your own opinion may fall. Acclaim and Probe were back again in 1994, this time with Stargate. One thing you begin to notice with these guys is that the blueprint for most of these games started to be the same. So when they get something wrong, it tends to stand out as a glaring issue with the gameplay. This one ends up as a frustrating one, because it not only has one, but two glaring issues that really keep it from being fun. First is your weapon fire is inaccurate and you can't see where you're actually shooting. Things you think you are hitting you aren't, leading to enemies getting in hits they otherwise wouldn't. The second is what should be the simple mechanic of ducking. Here you shoot down when trying to crouch, so you have to actually stop moving, let off the weapon fire, and then press down to perform a crouch. It sounds simple in mere words, but is utterly broken in practice. What that means is that in Stargate, you can't hit half of what you aim at, and just getting your character to crouch is a pain in the ass. That equals a game not even worth playing among its peers. The Terminator was released in 1992 by Virgin Games, and was another movie game developed by Probe. It isn't a bad game at all. It flows as you'd expect, an action side-scroller starring Kyle Reese as he fights in the future and then the past to save Sarah Connor. You don't start the game with much, but do get other weapons and bombs as the game progresses. This one can be hard, but is quite playable. Its only real problem is that Virgin Games released what I feel is a vastly superior version on the Sega CD. That version is completely different and so very much better, leaving me disappointed every time I try to play this one. Still, among movie games, this is far from the bottom of that barrel. The 16-bit era happened to be when the blockbuster film Terminator II was released. We'd get two distinct versions of the IP, the first being a light gun game that was compatible with the Sega Menacer. Simply titled T2 the arcade game, Probe was back yet again to do the honors of porting the Midway-made arcade original. Acclaim published it, and while it isn't the best gun game out there, the shocking inclusion of Menacer support makes it one of the better games to use that peripheral. It has two-player co-op, looks fairly good, and can be quite fun in short bursts. Those looking for an accurate arcade port will likely be left disappointed, as there are big changes to graphics, sound, and stage design. If you enjoy gun games though, it comes highly recommended. The second game released was done by Bit Studio and published under Acclaim's Flying Edge branding in 1993. And man, what a pile of steaming shit it is. Whereas the gun game is mindless playable fun, this is a complete train wreck of bad side-scrolling gameplay, visuals, and sound. It looks hardly better than an NES game, and has almost no redeeming qualities when it comes to gameplay. The animation is awful. The Terminator takes 3 punches to down simple knife-wielding enemies, and he has an utterly broken jump mechanic that has no place in the game at all. It's an embarrassment that all involved should apologize for, asking gamers to pay $50 for a broken, unplayable experience. One of the more interesting movie games to be released on the Genesis was 1996's Toy Story, a Traveler's Tales development that was published by Disney Interactive. This late release on the Genesis uses a number of impressive programming methods to make the Genesis do things it couldn't in hardware. Aside from the well-animated side-scrolling levels, you also get superscaler-style vehicle stages, and even raycasted first-person areas that are well above your expectations for the hardware. The gameplay is really the only thing that suffers here, mainly consisting of simple tasks that fail to hold your attention for very long. This one was on the cusp of being something great and unique, and it's sad to say it never quite got there. The visuals and variety of engines on display still make it worth a look. Acclaim and Beam Software were responsible for 1995's True Lies, an overhead run-and gun with lots of blood and some decent animation. Like many of these movie games, it's a pretty average affair that doesn't play so bad once you get used to the control scheme. This would have benefited greatly from a 2-player co-op mode and a slight tweak to how much damage enemies can take. Having to shoot guys 3 times or more to kill them becomes tiring, especially with a screen full of enemies. Otherwise, this didn't turn out nearly as bad as I would have thought. In 1992, Ballistic, an arm of Accolade, published Universal Soldier. It's a run-and-gun not too dissimilar to Contra, loaded with power-ups and is fairly challenging. It's a complete reworking of the game Turrican 2 by Factor 5, which had absolutely nothing to do with the content of the movie. Stages have been altered heavily here in certain areas, but the gameplay itself is mostly the same. You'll find that Mega Turrican is a better game in every way, but this still offers a good challenge and can be quite fun. Stages are huge with great verticality, and the music can be pleasant at times. It wasn't licensed by Sega, so the US version came in a shitty paper box and weird-shaped cartridge, making it an eyesore in your collection. In what is perhaps one of the strangest releases on the Genesis, Acclaim would get Real-Time Associates and Trimark Entertainment to develop Warlock in 1995. Based on the not-so-blockbuster movie of the same name, it's a side-scrolling action game that has you going after the titled character, trying to stop him from ending the world. Your magical powers and potions are all you have, and the Warlock will throw everything from mutated animals to zombies and bats at you. The animation here is really good, and nothing is wrong with the basic gameplay. Its biggest problem is just the lack of any kind of variety to everything. Stage and enemy design begin to blur together a few levels in, and you just start to lose interest. The lack of appeal of the property itself doesn't help either. I saved our last game specifically for this spot so I could give you the best example in the difference between an average playable game and one that is so fundamentally broken and unappealing that it's a complete waste of time. No game on the Genesis is better described with this than 1993's Wayne's World. Developed by Grey Matter and published by THQ, This adapts the popular Saturday Night Live sketch and movie into video game form, and does neither of them any justice at all. First, you are victimized by the atrocious visuals that have no appeal of any kind. Everything is dithered to hell, the animation is terrible, and the characters make you want to vomit. But not so fast. Almost as quickly as your eyes take in this pain, your ears are utterly and completely blown out by quite possibly the worst sound effects and music a video game has ever produced. I mean, I thought games like Marble Madness on the Genesis were rough, but this shit stain of a game makes that look like Beethoven's Symphony No. 5. Every attack is accompanied by a terrible guitar effect and consistently repeated voice samples that just make you want to gouge your ears out. Stopping here, I feel the game has committed enough sins to make anyone not want to play it. Yet it continues on a downward spiral that just has to be discussed. Stage and enemy design consists of things that have no rhyme or reason to them. Why the hell does a music store and pool hall have multiple floors with nothing connecting them? Why am I being attacked by disco balls, bagpipes, and other musical instruments? Why is free-flowing electricity everywhere? Why are random objects flying across the screen and through walls, taking life from me? I understand certain liberties need to be taken with an IP to make it an action game, but this takes every opportunity to be just an asinine assortment of ideas that fail to make a cohesive whole. It isn't just one of the worst movie games on the Genesis, it's one of the worst games on the platform, period. That rare blend of broken graphics, sound, stage design, and gameplay that isn't just bad, it's unbelievably offensive to the hobby in general. It makes every other game seen on this list look better next to its harsh light of just how bad things can be in a game. The team that did this also has their name on the Saturn title, The Crow City of Angels. They managed across 2 generations of consoles to make 2 of the worst games ever, traumatizing all who experienced them. I think the reason we do not see the same amount of movie tie-ins nowadays is because development costs quickly outpaced the worth of doing them when you had to pay crazy money for the property before you even began developing it. Most game companies would rather try and make their own IP with the risk being so high on modern hardware. After spending quite a bit of time playing each of these games, I can confidently tell you that many of them aren't all that bad. Certainly not up to the caliber of the better titles on the Genesis, but also not offensive enough to be labeled terrible. The real point that needs to be driven home is that the worst of these games were often made by the same development teams, meaning that their quality was less the side effect of being a game based on a movie, and more a case of who actually made a lot of these games in the first place. Virgin and Acclaim were responsible for much of this stuff, often using the same teams to churn out games in short development cycles. Many times the end product was playable, but when something was bad, man, it was really bad. The appeal of many of these games will likely hinge on your interest in the IP itself and the genre it falls into. I advise firing up an emulator or an EverDrive to give them a go before you buy a physical copy of any of them. There are some gems here, but even those will vary in appeal for gamers used to playing the best games on the system. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.